By sunrise in 1921, somewhere in Washington, nobody could explain what had happened on the Dike Road the night before. Tom Keever's dog, Brindle, had trotted ahead at dusk and vanished into peat mist, where drain ditches brayed like seams across the cranberry bog. The farmhands had watched him go, confident and steady, the way he'd gone 100 times before. And when they followed minutes later with lanterns swinging, they found his leather collar looped neat on a cedar stake, damp from the mist but faintly warm to the touch, and paw prints that stepped onto the weathered dike boards and simply stopped. Lantern light showed no slide marks, no scramble in the peat, no disturbance in the black water on either side, only water beating on planks that no one had crossed. The dog was gone. 3 nights later he came back whimpering at a door he'd never used, fur smelling of kerosene like from the pump house, eyes fixed on a place behind the men. He refused meat, refused the yard, and by morning he was gone again, the gate latched from the outside. After that, pickers said the dike breathed at sundown and wouldn't cross it with sacks on their backs. Folks in coastal Washington still say you don't answer a dog that calls from the bog after dark. The land out there in Washington sits low and gray, pressed flat between the coastal hills and the cold reach of Willapa Bay. Cranberry bogs stretch wide under a sky that hangs close, the color of wet stone, heavy with salt air and the promise of rain that never quite arrives. The dike runs narrow between black water and deeper water, built up with gravel and weathered plank, bordered by cedar stakes every 10 paces that lean slightly, worn smooth by years of wind and mist. Kerosene pumps squat at intervals along the line, their metal throats crusted with salt and rust, their wooden platforms sagging into the peat like old teeth. The mist comes in at dusk, thick as wool, and it carries a smell like iron and rotting wood together, something organic and cold. Men who worked the harvest said the bog breathed at certain hours, pulling air down into the water with a sound like distant sighing. And no one liked being out there when the light went soft, and the cedar stakes turned to shadows, and the planks underfoot felt slick and strange. Tom Keever was a steady man, close to 50, with a face like worn leather and hands that knew the weight of tools and the rhythm of hard work. He'd lived on the property since before the war, managing the pickers during harvest season and keeping the pumps running through the wet Washington winters when ice formed in the ditches and the bogs froze solid. He had a wife, Nora, who waited for him every evening with a pot of coffee on the stove and a lamp lit in the window, and a daughter, Esther, who was 12 and afraid of the dark spaces past the fence line, the places where the mist pooled thick and the sound of the pumps carried strange. Brindle was a cattle dog, black and tan, with a white blaze on his chest and ears that swiveled at the smallest sound. Tom trusted him more than he trusted most men. The dog knew the dike by heart, knew every turn, every stake, every place the board sagged under weight or where the water pooled black between the planks and reflected nothing. That evening, just past 6 o'clock when the light was starting to fail, Tom sent Brindle ahead to check the far pump. One of the intake valves had been sticking and Tom wanted to make sure it hadn't seized completely. The dog went without hesitation, tail high, moving along the dike with the confidence born of 100 trips before. 3 farmhands stood near the property gate, rolling cigarettes, waiting for Tom to finish his rounds before heading back to the bunkhouse for supper. They watched Brindle trot into the mist, his shape fading into gray, his paws making soft, hollow sounds on the wet planks. Then the sound stopped. No splash, no bark, no scramble or cry, just silence, and the mist closing in like a curtain pulled tight and the faint mechanical wheeze of the pumps in the distance. Tom called once, his voice sharp and clear in the cold air. He called twice, louder, and got nothing back but the sound of his own voice swallowed by the peat. The farmhands exchanged looks, stubbed out their cigarettes, and walked out onto the dike with lanterns, moving slow, checking every plank for gaps or weak spots, places where the wood might have given way. They found the collar 50 yards out, looped neat around a cedar stake like someone had hung it there with care and intention. The leather was still warm when Hale, one of the pickers, touched it with the back of his hand. He pulled his fingers away quickly, wiped them on his trousers, and looked at Tom without saying a word. The paw prints led straight down the middle of the dike, evenly spaced, clear in the damp grit and moss that covered the boards, and then they stopped. Not at the edge, not at a gap in the planks. Just stopped, mid-stride, as if Brindle had stepped into air and never came down, as if the bog had opened and closed without leaving a mark. Hale knelt and ran his hand over the boards where the prints ended. No scratch marks. No signs of struggle. No places where claws had dug in trying to hold purchase or where paws had slipped. The water on both sides sat flat and black. Not a ripple, not a disturbance. Nothing to suggest the dog had gone in or that anything had surfaced. They searched until full dark, lanterns swinging in wide arcs, voices calling the dog's name over and over until the sound felt hollow and useless, but the bog gave nothing back. The mist thickened as the temperature dropped, and the planks under their boots felt slick and strange, like the wood was sweating, like something underneath was breathing through the gaps. By the time they returned to the gate, Nora was standing on the porch with a shawl tight around her shoulders, and Esther was crying at the window, her face pressed to the glass, her breath fogging the pain. Tom didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table with the collar in front of him, turning it over in his hands, feeling the warmth that had long since faded into cold leather. Nora asked if they should search again in daylight, and Tom said yes, but his voice was hollow, like he already knew they wouldn't find anything. The next morning, he and 6 men walked the dike end to end, tying rag strips to the stakes to mark their path, checking every inch of board, every gap, every place the water lapped close. They found nothing. No body. No tracks beyond the ones they'd seen the night before. The water was too dark to see into, black as tar, but they dragged hooks through the shallows anyway, pulling up nothing but weeds and black mud that smelled like sulfur and rot. 3 nights later, Brindle came back. Not to the yard where he slept in a wooden box lined with burlap and old blankets. Not to the gate where Tom fed him scraps every morning before starting his rounds. He came to the kitchen door, the one that faced the backfield, the one no one used except to haul firewood in winter or carry water from the well. Nora heard the whimpering first, low and steady, like a sound pulled from deep in the dog's chest, rhythmic and pained. She opened the door, and there he was, sitting on the step, head down, body trembling like he'd been running for miles. His fur was damp, matted in places, and it smelled sharp and chemical, like kerosene, like he'd been lying near the pump house for hours. But the pump house had been locked for days, and Tom had the only key on a ring in his pocket. The dog's eyes were fixed on something behind Nora, something in the room, and he wouldn't look away. Not at her. Not at Tom when he came running from the parlor, just staring past them, pupils wide, body rigid. Tom knelt beside Brindle, ran his hands over the dog's ribs and legs, checking for wounds, for broken bones, for anything that might explain where he'd been. No wounds, no blood, no sign of injury. But Brindle wouldn't eat when Tom brought his dish, wouldn't drink water from the pail, wouldn't step past the threshold into the house even though he'd done it 1,000 times before. Tom carried him to the yard, set him down gently by his box, but the dog just stood there stiff-legged, staring back at the kitchen door like something inside had called to him, and he was waiting for it to call again, waiting for permission to follow. By morning, Brindle was gone. The gate was latched from the outside, the way Tom had left it when he checked the yard at midnight before going to bed. The latch was iron, heavy, the kind you had to lift with both hands. The dog was nowhere in the yard, nowhere in the field, nowhere along the dike or the fence line. Tom searched for 2 more days, called in neighbors from the adjoining properties, walked every inch of bog road within a mile, checked the ditches, the pump stations, the places where workers took breaks under the cedar cover. Nothing. The dog had vanished a second time, and this time there was no collar, no prints, no sign at all that he'd been there, except the faint smell of kerosene that lingered near the kitchen door for a week afterward. After that, the pickers refused to cross the dike with sacks on their backs. They said the planks breathed at sundown, said the mist had weight to it, like it could press you down if you stayed too long, like it had hands. They said you could feel something watching from the water, something patient and old, something that didn't move but knew you were there. Old hands in Washington told the younger ones, the ones fresh from the coast towns looking for harvest work. You don't answer a dog that calls from the peat after dark. And if you find a collar on a stake still warm, you leave it there. You don't touch it barehanded. You don't bring it home. And you don't ask what happened to Tom Keever's dog, because the bog out past the dike doesn't give answers, only questions that sit wrong in your chest long after you've walked away, questions that follow you back to the bunkhouse and keep you awake when the mist rolls in and the pumps start their slow mechanical wheeze in the dark. The search began again at first light. Tom Keever stood at the property gate with a dozen men from neighboring farms, their breath steaming in the cold morning air, and mapped out a grid that covered every acre of bog and dike road within 2 miles. They worked methodically, walking shoulder to shoulder through the cranberry fields, checking the drainage ditches, the pump stations, the places where cedar cover grew thick enough to hide a body or conceal something moving low to the ground. They tied fresh rag strips to the fence posts and stakes, white cotton that showed bright against the gray wood, marking every section they'd already searched so no ground would be covered twice. By noon, they'd covered the near side of the property and found nothing. By evening, they'd crossed into the far bogs where the water sat deeper, and the planks sagged under their weight with every step, and still there was nothing. No sign of the dog, no tracks, no disturbance in the peat, no place where the water had been broken. The timeline made no sense the more Tom went over it in his head. He had sent Brindle ahead at 6:15, just as the light was failing and the mist was starting to thicken along the dike. The 3 farmhands, Hale, Drummond, and a younger man named Cates, had been standing at the gate rolling cigarettes, and they'd watched the dog disappear into the mist around 6:20. By 6:30, they were on the dike with lanterns swinging, and by 6:40 they'd found the collar still warm to the touch, looped neat on the cedar stake like someone had placed it there with care. Tom himself had been standing at the gate the entire time, no more than 200 yards away, and he'd heard nothing. No bark, no splash, no sound of struggle or panic. Just the mechanical wheeze of the pumps cycling on and off, and the wind moving through the cedar stakes with a sound like distant breathing. He was just there, Hale said, standing by the gate with his hat in his hands, his voice low. 1 second he was walking, solid as anything. Next second, he was gone. Like the mist took him whole. But 3 nights later, the dog had come back. That part didn't fit any natural explanation, and it was the detail that kept people awake at night when the wind picked up and the pumps started their rhythmic wheeze in the dark. Nora had opened the kitchen door at 10 past midnight and found Brindle sitting on the step, trembling, his fur damp and reeking of kerosene like he'd been lying in a puddle of the stuff. Tom had been in the parlor, less than 20 feet away, reading by lamplight and waiting for exhaustion to pull him under. And he'd heard no sound of the dog approaching, no scratch at the door, no bark or whine, no pause on the wooden step. Just the whimpering that Nora heard low and steady coming from the other side of the wood. And the dog had been staring at something behind her, something in the room, his eyes fixed and wide like he was watching movement that no one else could see. Like something was standing just past her shoulder, and the dog was the only one who knew it was there. By the 4th day, people were talking, not openly, not in front of Tom or Nora where it might sound like accusation or judgment, but in the bunkhouse at night when the lanterns were turned low and in the general store in town when they thought no one important was listening. Some said Tom had enemies, men he'd fired over the years for drinking on the job or stealing tools from the pump house, men who might have taken the dog out of spite or to send a message. Others said the bog had always been strange, that the pickers who'd worked there longest refused to go near the far pump after dark, that the water out past the dike didn't sit right, didn't reflect light the way water should, sometimes showed things on its surface that weren't in the sky above. A few whispered it wasn't a dog at all that had come back to the kitchen door that night, that the thing sitting on the step had only looked like Brindle from a distance, that its eyes had been wrong, its shape slightly off, like something trying to remember how a dog should sit and getting the details almost right but not quite. The older hands in Washington told the younger ones not to cross the dike alone anymore, not at dusk when the light went soft, not before sunrise when the mist sat thickest, not when the fog rolled in from the bay so thick you couldn't see the stakes 10 feet ahead. They said the bog out there had taken things before, tools that vanished from the pump platforms overnight, wrenches and coils of wire that reappeared weeks later in different places, rag markers that disappeared and came back, tied to stakes no one had touched, sounds that didn't match anything living, rhythms that didn't fit the pumps or the wind or the water moving through the ditches. One man, a picker named Voss who'd worked the harvest for 15 years and knew every inch of the property, said he'd seen a lantern burning on the far side of the dike one winter night, steady and bright. When he knew for certain the pump house was locked and no one had the key but Tom, he'd gone out to check, walking slow with his own lantern raised high. And by the time he reached the spot where the light had been burning, there was nothing. Just cold planks slick with moisture, and black water lapping quiet at the edges, and the smell of something burned like oil or kerosene, lingering in the air strong enough to taste. On the 6th day, Tom found something that stopped him cold and made his hands go numb. He was walking the dike alone, against the advice of everyone who'd helped with the search, checking the stakes one more time in full daylight, when the mist had burned off, and the sky was clear enough to see the coastal hills in the distance. Near the spot where they'd found the collar, he saw a second set of prints in the damp grit that covered the planks. Not paw prints this time, but boot prints, narrow and shallow, leading from the cedar cover toward the water's edge, and then stopping abruptly, just like the dog's prints had stopped 6 days before. The boots were small, maybe a woman's size or a young man's, and the impressions were fresh, pressed deep enough into the grit to show the tread pattern clearly, but no one had been out there. Tom had walked the dike at sunrise alone, checking every stake, and the prints hadn't been there then. Now, 3 hours later, they were. He knelt and touched the edge of one print with his finger, brushing away a thin layer of grit to see the depth. The impression was damp, recently disturbed, and there was a faint smell in the air. Kerosene again, sharp and chemical. The same smell that had clung to Brindle's fur the night he came back, and that Voss had described smelling near the phantom lantern light. Tom looked around slowly, scanning the cedar cover where the trees grew dense and tangled, the water where nothing moved, the line of stakes stretching into the distance like grave markers. Nothing moved, no sound except the steady mechanical wheeze of the pumps and the wind rattling through the dry reeds at the water's edge. But the prints were there, undeniable, leading from nowhere and stopping at nothing, and Tom felt something cold settle in his chest, something that had nothing to do with the November air or the damp rising from the peat. That night, the dog came back a third time, not to the kitchen door, not to the yard where his box sat empty and lined with old blankets. Tom heard scratching at the front gate just after 10 o'clock, rhythmic and insistent, metal on metal like claws dragging across the iron latch. When he went out with a lantern held high, Brindle was there, standing on the other side of the gate, his head low, his body shaking like he'd been running hard or standing in cold water for hours. Tom opened the gate, lifting the heavy latch with both hands, and the dog stepped through, but he didn't come toward Tom the way he always had before. He walked past him slowly, stiffly, moving toward the house like he was being pulled on a rope no one could see, like something ahead was calling and he had no choice but to follow. Tom called his name, sharp and clear, and the dog stopped, turned his head just slightly and looked at Tom with eyes that seemed flat, empty, like something behind them had burned out and left only the shape. Then he kept walking, past the porch, past the kitchen door where Nora stood watching with her hand over her mouth, and disappeared around the side of the house toward the back field where the grass grew tall and wild. Tom followed, lantern raised, calling the dog's name over and over, his voice carrying across the empty field. But by the time he reached the corner of the house, the dog was gone. The field was empty, frost-covered and silver in the moonlight, no movement anywhere. The gate that led to the back pasture was still latched, the iron cold and undisturbed. There were no tracks in the frost-covered grass, no prints, no sign that anything had walked through. Tom stood there for a long time, breathing hard, the lantern shaking in his hand, and felt the weight of something he couldn't name pressing down on his shoulders, something that made the air feel thicker, and the night feel longer than it should. After that, the farmhands refused to work the far side of the property after 4 o'clock. They said the dike wasn't safe, that the planks shifted under your feet in ways that didn't match the wind or the water, that you could hear things moving under the boards when you stood still long enough to listen. Soft scraping sounds, rhythmic and patient, like something dragging itself along the underside. The pickers said the pumps ran differently at dusk, that the rhythm changed without explanation, that sometimes you'd hear an extra beat, a pause that shouldn't be there, like something breathing in time with the machinery and waiting for you to notice. Nora stopped opening the kitchen door after dark, no matter what sound came from the other side. Esther refused to go past the fence line at all, even in daylight, even with her father beside her, and she slept with the lamp burning in her room every night until the oil ran low. And Tom Keever, the steady man who'd worked that land for 20 years without fear or superstition, stopped sleeping. He sat at the kitchen table every night with the collar in front of him, turning it over in his hands, feeling the leather that had been warm once and was cold now, wondering what had happened in the 60 seconds between the time Brindle walked into the mist and the time the collar appeared on the stake, warm and waiting, looped neat like an offering or a warning or an invitation to follow. People in Washington still don't talk about it openly, not in daylight, not where strangers can hear, but the old hands tell the new ones the same thing every harvest season when the mist rolls in thick and the pumps start their rhythmic wheeze. You don't cross that dike alone. You don't answer if you hear something calling from the peat. And if you see a dog out there after dark, walking steady with no sound, you turn around and you don't look back. Because whatever it isn't asking you to follow. It's showing you where you'll go if you do. By the second week, the search had turned into something else, not a rescue anymore, but a ritual, a way for the community to hold on to the idea that reason still applied to what had happened on the dike. Men came out every morning at sunrise, walking the grid they'd already walked a dozen times, tying new rag strips to stakes that already held faded ones, dragging hooks through water they'd already dragged, checking the same pump platforms and cedar thickets and drainage ditches with a kind of grim determination that had nothing to do with hope. They were searching because not searching felt worse, because stopping meant admitting that the bog had taken something it wouldn't give back, and that the rules they'd lived by, cause and effect, evidence and explanation, didn't hold out past the dike where the mist sat thick and the water reflected nothing. Tom Keever walked with them every day, silent and hollow-eyed, moving through the routine like a man underwater. He checked the stakes. He marked the rag strips. He knelt in the damp grit and studied the ground for prints that hadn't been there the day before. And every evening, just before dusk, he walked out to the spot where they'd found the collar and stood there alone, waiting for something he couldn't name, waiting for the dog to come back again, or for the mist to part and show him what it had taken, or for some sign that what had happened made sense in a world that still followed logic. On the 14th day, Tom found the note. It was wedged between two boards on the dike, about 20 yards past the spot where the collar had been. A small piece of paper, folded once, damp but not soaked, tucked into a gap that Tom had walked past 100 times without seeing. He pulled it out carefully, unfolded it with shaking hands, and recognized the handwriting immediately. It was his own. The words were simple, written in pencil in the cramped script he used for equipment logs. Check the south pump. Valve sticking again. It was the kind of note he might have written to himself a dozen times over the years, a reminder to follow up on routine maintenance. But Tom hadn't written this note. He was certain of that. He'd checked the south pump 3 days ago, and the valve had been fine. And the paper itself was wrong. It was too clean, too dry, for something that had been sitting exposed to the mist and the damp for 2 weeks. He showed it to Hale, who turned it over in his hands and said nothing for a long time. Then Hale looked at Tom with an expression that was part fear and part something else, something like recognition. "That's your writing," Hale said quietly. "No question." Tom nodded. "But I didn't write it," he said. "Not this one." Hale folded the note carefully and handed it back. "Maybe you did and forgot," he said, but his voice had no conviction. "Maybe it's been there longer than we think." But they both knew that wasn't true. The paper was too clean, the pencil marks too dark, and the note had appeared in a gap they'd inspected a week ago, a gap that had been empty then and full now, like something had placed it there deliberately, like something wanted them to find it. After that, the theories started circulating in earnest. Some said Tom had enemies, Men from the old days who held grudges and knew how to make trouble without showing their faces. A picker named Drummond said he'd heard Tom had fired a man named Lassiter 3 years back for drinking, and that Lassiter had threatened to come back and settle the score. But no one had seen Lassiter in years, and the note didn't feel like revenge. It felt like something else, something stranger, like a message from a place that didn't follow the same rules as the world outside the bog. Others said the land out past the dike had always been wrong, that the pickers who'd worked there before the war had refused to go near the far pump after dark, that the water there didn't freeze right in winter and didn't warm right in summer, that things disappeared and reappeared without explanation. A few whispered it wasn't Tom's handwriting at all, that it only looked like his, that something had learned to copy the shapes of his letters the way it had learned to copy the shape of his dog. The older hands in Washington told the younger ones that the bog out past the dike never gave back what it took. Not whole, not the way it was before. They said you could lose a tool out there and find it weeks later in a place you'd already searched, and the tool would be clean, oiled, laid out neat like someone had been taking care of it. They said you could hear voices sometimes, calling from the cedar cover or from across the water. Voices that sounded like people you knew saying things you recognized, but if you followed them, you'd end up walking in circles until the mist closed in and you couldn't find your way back. They said the pumps out there ran on their own sometimes, cycling on and off with no one at the controls. And if you went to check them, you'd find the platforms warm, the metal faintly hot like hands had just been working the levers, but the pump house would be locked and empty. On the 16th day, Tom found something else. He was checking the far pump alone against everyone's advice, walking the narrow plank path that led from the dike to the platform where the machinery sat rusting and patient. The pump was running, which was strange because Tom hadn't turned it on, hadn't been out there in 3 days. He climbed onto the platform and checked the controls. The lever was pulled to the on position, the valve open, the mechanism cycling steadily, and on the platform, laid out neat beside the toolbox, was a second collar, leather, worn, identical to the one they'd found on the stake 2 weeks before. Tom picked it up slowly, his hands numb. It was Brindle's collar. He was certain. The same stitching, the same brass buckle, the same places where the leather had worn thin from years of use. But the first collar was still at the house, still sitting on the kitchen table where Tom had left it that morning. He'd seen it, touched it, locked the door behind him when he left. He stood there on the platform with the second collar in his hands, the pump whizzing beside him, the mist rolling in thick from the bay, and felt the ground shift under his feet in a way that had nothing to do with the sagging boards. This wasn't theft. This wasn't a prank. This was something else. Something that didn't fit any framework he had for understanding the world. He looked out across the water, across the cedar stakes and the dike and the flat gray stretch of bog that extended to the horizon, and for the first time in his life he felt small, felt like something was watching him from a place he couldn't see, something patient and old that had been there long before he built the dike and would be there long after he was gone. When he got back to the house, the first collar was gone. The kitchen table was empty. Nora said she hadn't touched it, hadn't moved it, hadn't seen anyone come in. The door had been locked, the windows latched, but the collar was gone, and in its place was a faint smell, kerosene, sharp and chemical, lingering in the air like something had been standing there holding the leather and then taken it away. Tom set the second collar down on the table and Nora stepped back, her hand over her mouth. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't bring it inside." But it was already inside. The smell was already in the house. And that night they heard scratching again, soft and rhythmic, coming from the kitchen door, the door no one used, the door that faced the back field where the dog had disappeared into the frost-covered grass. After that night, nobody in Washington took that dike alone before dawn. Not the workers, not the neighbors, not the men who'd known Tom Keever for 20 years and trusted his judgment on everything else. The rule was simple, passed down from the older hands to the younger ones without explanation. 2 men, never one, and never after the mist comes in. They said the bog, out past the dike, had rules of its own, rules that didn't match the ones you learned in church or school or from your father. And if you broke those rules, the bog would teach you new ones, would show you things you couldn't unsee and give you back pieces of what you lost in ways that made you wish it had kept everything. They said Tom Keever's dog was still out there, walking the dike at dusk, and if you saw him, you didn't call his name, didn't whistle, didn't try to bring him home, because the thing wearing his shape wasn't his anymore, and hadn't been since the night the collar appeared on the stake, warm and waiting, like a gift from something that didn't understand what gifts were for. Tom stopped going to the dike after dark. He stopped checking the far pump alone. He stopped opening the kitchen door at night no matter what sound came from the other side. And he kept the second collar in a wooden box under the bed, wrapped in cloth, where Nora wouldn't have to see it, and Esther wouldn't have to ask questions he couldn't answer. But sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet and the pumps had cycled off and the only sound was the wind moving through the cedar stakes, he'd take the collar out and hold it in his hands and try to understand what had happened in the mist, what had taken his dog and given back something that looked like him but wasn't, what had written a note in his handwriting and left it where he'd find it, what had doubled the collar and made him carry the second one home like a man bringing back proof of something impossible. And he never found an answer, because the bog out past the dike in Washington doesn't give answers. It only gives you pieces of the truth, one at a time, and makes you live with the spaces in between. The years passed, but the dike didn't change. The cedar stakes leaned a little more. The planks sagged deeper into the peat. The pumps wheezed and rusted and were replaced with newer models that made the same sounds, the same rhythmic breathing that echoed across the bog at dusk. Tom Keever kept working the land, kept managing the harvest, but something in him had gone quiet, had turned inward in a way that made people uncomfortable to be around. Nora stayed and Esther grew up and left for Seattle the week she turned 18, and she never came back, not even for visits, not even when her mother wrote letters asking her to. The house stayed standing, the kitchen door stayed locked at night, and the wooden box under the bed stayed closed, the second collar wrapped in cloth inside it, untouched but not forgotten. By 1925, most of the original workers had moved on. Some went to other farms where the land felt safer, where the mist didn't sit so heavy and the water didn't reflect things that weren't in the sky. Others left Washington altogether, heading east or south to places where the bogs were smaller and the stories were less strange. The new workers who came in to replace them were told the rules on their first day. 2 men, never one, and never past the far pump after the mist comes in. They were told not to answer if they heard whistling from the cedar cover, not to follow lights that appeared on the dike at night, not to touch anything they found laid out neat on the pump platforms, tools, rags, collars, notes, no matter how familiar those things looked. Most of them laughed at first, thought it was hazing, the kind of superstition old men used to scare the young ones, but after a week or two, after they'd walked the dike at dusk and felt the planks shift under their feet in ways that didn't match the wind, after they'd heard the pumps cycle on when no one was at the controls, after they'd seen the way Tom Keever's face went blank and distant when someone asked about his dog, they stopped laughing, and they followed the rules. The dog was seen again over the years, always at dusk, always near the dike. A picker in 1927 saw it sitting on the far pump platform perfectly still, staring out across the water. When he called to it, it turned its head slowly and looked at him with eyes that didn't blink, didn't move, and then it stood and walked off the platform into the mist without making a sound. A foreman in 1931 saw it trotting along the dike, moving steady and purposeful, and he swore it was Brindle, same build, same markings, same white blaze on the chest. But when he got closer, the dog stopped and turned, and the foreman said later that the shape was wrong, that the legs were too long or the head was too low, that it looked like something trying to remember how a dog should move but getting the details slightly off. He didn't follow it. He turned around and walked back to the gate, and he refused to go out on the dike alone after that, refused to work past 4 o'clock, refused to explain why except to say that the dog wasn't a dog anymore and hadn't been for a long time. In 1934, a new worker named Pruitt found a third collar. He was checking the south pump at midday, full sun, no mist, and there it was, laid out neat on the platform beside the toolbox, the leather worn and familiar. He picked it up, carried it back to the house, and showed it to Tom, who was nearly 60 by then and moved like a man twice his age. Tom looked at the collar for a long time without touching it, and then he told Pruitt to take it back, to put it exactly where he'd found it, and to never bring anything off the dike again, no matter what it was or how ordinary it looked. Pruitt did as he was told, and when he went back to the platform, the collar was gone. He'd been gone less than 10 minutes. The platform was empty. The toolbox was closed. And there was a faint smell in the air, sharp and chemical, that made his throat tighten and his eyes water. The community adapted. The rules became culture, passed down like recipes or the names of old families. Parents told their children not to go near the dike after school, not to play in the cedar cover, not to answer if they heard something calling from the water. Teachers adjusted the school schedule so no child had to walk past the bog road in the early morning or late afternoon when the mist was thickest. Fishermen who worked the bay avoided the stretch of water that ran parallel to the dike, said the fish there tasted wrong, metallic and bitter, like they'd been feeding on something that didn't belong in the ecosystem. The general store in town stopped stocking certain supplies, kerosene lamps, leather collars, cedar stakes, because people from the Keever property stopped buying them, stopped replacing things that wore out, like they were afraid to bring new versions of old objects onto the land. Tom Keever died in 1938, alone in the house, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee in front of him. Nora found him in the morning, and she said later that his face looked peaceful, but his eyes were open and fixed on the kitchen door, the door that faced the back field, the door no one had used in 17 years. The wooden box under the bed was gone. The second collar was gone. And on the table, folded neat beside the coffee cup, was a note in Tom's handwriting. Check the south pump, valve sticking again. Nora burned it without showing anyone. She sold the property 6 months later to a family from Oregon who didn't know the stories, didn't ask about the dike, didn't understand why the workers they hired refused to stay past harvest season. The new family lasted 2 years. In 1940, their daughter, 8 years old, saw the dog. She was playing in the yard at dusk and she called to her mother, excited, saying there was a dog by the fence, a pretty dog with a white mark on its chest. By the time her mother came out, the dog was gone, but the girl said it had been staring at her, not moving, just staring, and that its eyes had been wrong, flat and empty like painted glass. The family left a month later. The property changed hands 3 more times over the next decade, and each time the new owners left within a year, citing problems with the land, with the equipment, with the workers who wouldn't stay, with the feeling that something was wrong in a way they couldn't articulate or fix. By 1950, the property was abandoned. The house stood empty. The pumps rusted and stopped running. The dike sagged and broke in places, and the bog water crept back over the cranberry fields, reclaiming the land slowly, patiently, the way it had always been going to. The cedar stakes leaned and fell, and the rag strips rotted away, and the planks turned soft and black and sank into the peat. But people in Washington still talk about the dike, still tell the stories when the mist rolls in and the light goes soft. They say Tom Keever's dog is still out there, walking the line where the planks used to be, and if you see it at dusk, you don't call to it. Don't try to bring it home because it's not looking for home anymore. It's looking for something else, something that got lost in the mist and never came back. And if you follow it, you'll end up the same way. Gone but not gone. Present but not present. Walking a line between the world you knew and a place that doesn't have a name. The old hands in Washington still tell the younger ones the same rules even now, even though the dike is gone and the bog has taken back the land. They say you don't go out on the bog roads alone after dusk. You don't answer if you hear something calling from the water. You don't touch things you find laid out neat in places no one should have been. And if you see a dog out there, black and tan with a white blaze on its chest, you turn around and you walk away. Because whatever it isn't asking for help. It's showing you the way in. And once you follow, the bog doesn't let you leave. Not the way you were, not whole. It gives you back in pieces, one at a time, warm and wrong and impossible. And it makes the people who loved you live with the spaces in between, the parts that didn't come home, the parts that stayed out in the mist where the pumps used to breathe and the cedar stakes used to stand and the water still doesn't reflect the sky the way water should. So which version makes sense here? The human one, where enemies took revenge and coincidence piled on coincidence until the story felt strange, or the natural one, where a dog got lost and the land played tricks and memory did the rest. Or the impossible one that nobody in Washington dares to say out loud. The one where the bog out past the dike takes things and gives them back changed. Where collars appear warm on stakes and notes appear in handwriting that shouldn't exist. And dogs come home, wearing shapes that don't quite fit. What detail in this story should not exist in a normal world? And why do people around the bogs in Washington still follow rules that were written for a dike that doesn't stand anymore? For a dog that disappeared 100 years ago? For a man who died looking at a door he'd kept locked since the night something came back and sat on the step, whimpering, staring at a place behind the living where only the dead could see? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.